Hello, I'm Robert Lance, and today I will be breaking down the AI behavior in GTFO and Hunt Showdown. Both games are being played on the Windows platform and locked to 60 frames per second. First, I will break down the AI units in GTFO. First thing of note is how the enemies act when they don't know the player is there. Because GTFO is a stealth-heavy game, the enemy AI will continue on their set route or stay completely still until they notice the player. There are many ways for the enemies to be alerted to the player, and the first one is noise. If the player were to run around through the area without crouching, firing their weapon, or setting off an explosive, the enemies in the area would be alerted and become hostile toward the player. Another way the enemies become aware of the player is if one notices you, they will alert the others to your presence by performing a loud shriek and becoming hostile. And finally, the other form of detection that the enemies have is when the player aims their flashlight at the enemy. This will cause the enemy that has the flashlight on it to become alerted and again notify the rest of the enemies of your presence. After the enemies have been alerted to the player's presence, they will merge on the player and begin to attack. Most of the enemies use a close range attack to deal damage to the player, but there are a few enemies that stay at a distance and perform long range attacks. The enemy's melee attack is a tentacle that they whip at the player, and the long-range enemies launch a bright projectile at the player. All close combat enemies can attack when they get within a 7-unit radius of the player, using the tentacle whip. Now, looking at Hunt Showdown, the enemy behavior is very similar to that of GTFO. When the player has not been noticed, they will move around in a set area from where they spawn. And there are multiple ways for the enemies to notice the player. The first way that the enemies notice the player is by noise. If the player makes too much noise by moving around without crouching, walking over broken glass, hitting hanging chains, scaring crows, walking too close to a dog pen, or firing their weapon, it will alert the enemy and they will become hostile toward the player. The next way that an enemy can notice the player is when they directly see the player. When the player is within roughly a 20 to 25 unit radius of the enemy, the player is able to be seen by the enemy. If the enemy were to look at the player while they were within the range, the enemy would become alerted to them and become hostile toward the player. After the enemies have discovered the player, the other enemies surrounding the discovering enemy will become alerted and merge on the player and start attacking. The basic enemies in Hunt Showdown only use melee combat when engaging the player. Some enemies added elemental damage to their weapon, but still only use melee to fight. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.